Hello, welcome back. So now we are on to more of like the city, now that you're in the US immigrant experience. So as you can kind of see from the background of this picture, it is very overcrowded here in New York City and in most major urban centers, especially up and down the East Coast. So the urban population of the United States grew from about 10 million to over 30 million just within the span of 30 years. And a lot of that was due to immigration, the huge waves of new people coming into the cities, but also because of industrialization, right? We already have talked about the market revolution and the industrial revolution, more from the mid 1800s. And then over the course of this unit, we're actually going to be talking about the second industrial revolution. So we are going to keep getting more and more modernized, having more factories, more assembly lines, more jobs for people that are taking on the manufacturing industry side as opposed to that agrarian farming like culture. So more and more people, because of the jobs, are moving to the city. So it's becoming pretty packed. But since it's such a quick boom, right? Like over the course of 30 years, it grew by 20 million people. It's hard for cities to keep up with the housing needs and transportation needs and health needs and sanitation needs and all of that, just quality of life stuff for folks. So we're going to see a lot of issues coming down the pipeline. Now, before we get to some of that, we do have to mention that part of the immigrant experience is the experience of bigoted hate. So we call these people nativists. So this is the idea that like this ugly little guy here is saying, we hate all of you immigrants. This is our land, born right-wise. Meaning, hey, you people weren't here first. We were here first. This is our land. We don't want you. A lot of times, nativists were people who had been leftovers from the generations of the American Revolutionary War and had been here, and their families had been here for ages and ages. And they thought that it was their country. They were worried that new people from different countries than their families were from, so people who also looked different than them, right? Like Southern and Eastern European folks look different than very like British Isle, like the paleness of the British Isle skin tones, right? Asian immigrants are going to look very different than the British Isle nativist, right? So people were starting to look different. They were from different cultures. They were from different countries. And the nativists were worried about, if you weren't from here originally, you're going to come in, you're going to take our jobs, you're going to disrupt our culture, and we're threatened by you. And so what do? They have a lot of very racist and nativist mentality. So they would put up signs saying Irish need not apply. They would limit where people could shop or work or eat or live, and kind of ran them out with hate speech, with hateful acts, and very much wanted to stop immigration, or at the very least limit it, so that more of the people who have been here, who were native, quote unquote, to the United States, would be the ones in power and the ones that were maintaining the jobs, maintaining the culture of the U.S. Now, a great example of nativism at its finest is when all of that prejudice ended up coming into our political and legislative side. So the Chinese Exclusion Act came about in 1882, and it prevented Chinese folks to immigrate to the U.S. unless they were students, teachers, merchants, tourists, or government officials. So that you had to already have something lined up to be able to come and fit one of those parameters. So that happened in 1882. Partially it's because the government and the Americans that were already in America were afraid of this other new type of person that was coming into the United States. Again, worried about infiltrating their culture, ruining their quote unquote American values, taking their jobs. And then in 1902, the Chinese immigration was actually restricted indefinitely. There was no time limit. It was just always there, that unless you fit these certain parameters, you would not be allowed. And the law was actually not repealed until 1943. So the idea was, hey, let's put an actual policy on the books to prevent certain types of people from coming into the US. So you can see here in this cartoon, Uncle Sam kicking out any Chinese immigrants and showing, hey, we have a law on the books. This is why you're not allowed. You can also see this is a pretty famous cartoon, the great fear of the period, that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. So you see we have what is an Irish immigrant to the left and a Chinese immigrant to the right. And they're worried, they meaning the like American politics, were worried that Uncle Sam, this image of American values, American culture, the American dream, the Americans that were white who had been here since the beginning, who founded this country, blah, 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 that this whole America that we knew was going to get destroyed and completely eaten away and unrecognizable by the immigrants coming in. And so that was that fear. So the fear propelled folks to say, hey, don't let any other people in. We're cool with how we are. Let's just keep it as is. Again, I think we can draw a lot of comparisons between what we're seeing here and what we're seeing in today's world. So take some time as we're moving through this to jot down maybe some of that comparison piece. How is this something that we could see happening in today's world? So again, take a little pause, and I want you to pause this video and to answer this question. So based on this document to the left, identify one reason that many native-born Americans in the late 1800s were in favor of restricting immigration. So again, take a pause, look at this, think about what we just talked about. Let's just check for our understanding. What's one reason that many native-born Americans in the late 1800s were in favor of restricting immigration? Okay, we all good? Great. So let's talk a little bit about skyscrapers. So kind of something that maybe you haven't thought about, right? Like, why did skyscrapers become a thing? They weren't always a thing, right? Like we didn't have the technology or the infrastructure to do it at first. But skyscrapers actually got started during this time period because there was nowhere to fit all of the people. There were too many people and they could not fit in the housing complexes that we had that were only, a normal row home type thing, right? So now we were building these skyscrapers that were many stories high that could just pack the people in. They could be eventually used for businesses, but at this time period, they were mostly used for housing. Now, you'll see here is this idea called Americanization. So this was a process that immigrants would come to school in America and they were taught English as a language because a lot of them didn't speak English, right? They came from these foreign countries. So they needed to learn the English language, which was the common language throughout the country. But in addition to learning the language, the other purpose of these schools were to assimilate the ethnic immigrant groups into the dominant culture. That is, we needed to get the people who were from different cultures into the idea of what it means to be an American. So again, this all is coming forth from that fear that, oh, these people from other cultures are going to ruin our culture of Americanism. So we need to instead, one way to combat that is let's teach them, all new folks, about the American culture. I mean, think about when you go to a new job, right? Maybe you're at your new work study job in the fall and we have that day of orientation, right? Where you kind of get a feel for it. And even the first couple days of work, you kind of get a feel for some of the policies and practices at your job. You kind of get to feel the culture of the place. And okay, shoot, if I want to do my job right and if I don't want to get fired from my work study position, I need to follow along with this culture. I need to know how to do things, how everything works here, who I should respect and who I should be listening to and reporting to, and what the kind of vibe is here, right? Same deal here. This is almost just like an onboarding process where folks coming from different backgrounds are suddenly learning about what it means to be an American, what it means to be assimilated to that culture, and to learn how to work within the kind of work the game of the American system. Okay, so these schools were often run by religious groups because religious folks often offered to help onboard some immigrants and to help especially the urban poor. There was a lot of poor folks at this time living in these living in these urban areas. And so there started to be this thing called the settlements, or settlement housing. So a settlement house is a neighborhood-based organization that provides services designed to assist the poor. So the first ever settlement house was a place called Hull House, Hull, and then House, House. And this was started by a woman named Jane Addams out in Chicago. And so the idea of this is that we're going to use this house, quote unquote, as like a hub of the community. So we'll have education classes, we'll have English as a second language training for adults who like did not belong in these immigrant schools that we just talked about. It's going to help people find jobs. It's going to help them figure out how to navigate some of the systems within the community. So if they needed healthcare, if they needed to see a doctor, if they needed to find a grocery store, or a food market or whatever, help them navigate the environments that they were living in better. Which we still have things like this today, right? We still have kind of these community centers that meet, or like community-based schools that offer a bunch of different resources to communities. This is where that all got started. And this idea of settlement housing and this idea of kind of doing justice for the folks that are coming in and making sure that you're doing right by people, and that you're making sure that this American culture is developed and recognized and solidified, sprang out of this idea of the social gospel movement. So the social gospel movement was another religious reform. So we've talked before about the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. This is another religious movement. So where religious reformers strove to improve conditions in the cities based off of what they had read in the Bible and these ideas of charity and social justice. So meaning folks who were religious felt like it was their duty to go out and seek justice and to give charitably to the people who needed their help. And so at this time period, one of the biggest recipients of this charity were immigrants. So their ideas within the social gospel movement was, how can we reconstruct urban society to be something that meets the needs of the poor and the middle class, and making sure that we're supporting each other during this time of building. And so a great example of this is the YMCA. The YMCA is a product of the social gospel movement. This guy, Dwight Moody, started the first YMCA out in Chicago as well. Chicago was really a hub for these social movements and these community center kind of social justice things. And all of that, the settlement housing, YMCA, where you were reaching the needs of the people who need it, all of this sprang from that social gospel movement. Now, another piece that we're going to talk about, this was another one of the vocab words, was ethnic enclave. So we've even seen this today, right? There's like we have Chinatowns in different cities. We have like little Italies in Philly. Like if you go down to South Philly, it's still a very heavy Italian population. Up in like Port Richmond, still a very Polish population, right? So this idea is that when immigrants came over, they wanted to be with people like them. Like they were trying to assimilate to this American culture, but they were also dealing with all the backlash of the nativists. They needed to find each other and feel like they had home. So immigrants would really come together, live in the same types of neighborhoods, the same kind of city blocks, and all live together. And it formed these things that we call an ethnic enclave. So this idea that when you went into this little neighborhood of a city, you felt like you were in Poland. You felt like you were in Ireland. You felt like you were in Italy. You felt like you were in China. Like things that made you feel like home, whether it was the food, the music, the activities, the people, the language that was being spoken. All of those help create these little ethnic enclaves throughout the cities. And that's what makes our cities so vibrant for today, because these things have lasted on and on and on since these late 1800s, early 1900s. And that just says what I just said. Great. So there's one more thing that we got to talk about, and I'm going to take a pause and start a new video for this one. So hang tight.